Righto folks, something a little bit unusual for a track car. This is the electronic power steering kit, and we're going to stick it in my MX-5. Righto, let's have a look what's in the box. I've kind of already pulled things apart a little bit, so I have cheated, I'm sorry. First up, instructions. Yeah, we'll get back to those in a sec. Secondly, you've got kind of a steering column. Now, as far as I could tell, this is the OEM kind of Mazda steering column that they've cut and welded to modify it to suit the motor. Definitely looks that way. It's kind of got a bit of surface rust on here and stuff, and they've sort of welded things and then given a hit of paint, but definitely looks like an OEM repurposed one that they've found. There's a bracket that goes down below near your feet effectively to hold things together. Big fat wiring harness, effectively some power feed wires from the battery or the alternator or something like that into the control box. And a big fat inline fuse here, 60 amps, so it's pretty big. We've got the control box that mounts up under the dash somewhere. I guess we'll see where that ends up, with some big connectors in. One of them obviously is this one. I'm assuming it's power in, then a power out to the motor. There's a Deutsch plug here, and then a small 6-pin plug there as well. We'll find out what those are for. This is effectively a control pot or a knob to dial the, I guess, strength of the motor in and out, so you can effectively dial it down, have lots of effort in the steering wheel, dial it fully up, and then the steering wheel will turn like with a single finger. 2-wire pin, that obviously goes into there. A couple of bolts, maybe to hold this on, don't know, we'll see. Then we have the heavy part, the motor itself. So we've got, as I suspected, we've got our power wire out of this guy, and we've got a Deutsch plug. So that's obviously the control from the control box to control the smart parts, and a small adapter. Now this, as far as I can tell, is the foot end, because that's the steering end. So that'll go down near your feet, near the firewall. This bracket holds those bits all together. This bolt's somewhere in the middle, and we've got a sticker, which I probably won't use. Looks like that's about it. What does that all mean? OEM steering column comes out, which is kind of that bit and a bit of extension in between, and it's replaced with that, with the motor that obviously adds some steering effort or saves my arms. There's a lot of talk about, is it going to kind of numb the steering feel? Potentially, yeah. I guess that's the threat, that's the risk of power steering. Look, Formula 1 cars have power steering. Obviously, they're a bit more glamorous than this, but I'm a weak little old man now, you know. My shoulders and my arms aren't as strong as they used to be. I need help these days. And this looked like an interesting proposition, so I want to give it a go. Maybe it'll be a bad choice and I should stick with, or go back to OEM hydraulic power steering or something, I don't know. This car runs a factory power steering rack, but with the power steering part depowered. But yeah. Now, the kit is sold for, effectively for left-hand drive cars, with a little star saying you can fit it on right-hand drive cars. It just might not fit as neat and tidy. I'm guessing they're saying that because obviously right-hand drive car, which is what I've got here, the dash is kind of flipped upside down and all the bits underneath aren't quite the same as left-hand drive car, so exactly how this bolts up might not be exactly the same. It's all a bit of a, we'll see what happens. My car, a lot of the interior is already gutted, don't have things like an ignition switch to worry about, the key to worry about for the steering lock and that sort of stuff. So I've got a few less pain points. It's going to be a fairly straightforward install. It looks like this kit is more or less standalone. The only thing that goes outside of the kit is the 2 wires to power the thing, and somewhere to mount the switch. Otherwise it kind of should be bolt in. That's the kit. I paid full price. I bought it from Miata, I think, or somewhere like that. I'll put a link somewhere. It was about $1,000 or so. Yeah, stick it in and let's have a look at how it goes inside the car. All right, so let's just talk quickly through what's going on. So first of all, I've pulled the dash out. For me, it's like a cut down, shrunken version of a dash, so it comes out really easy. It's just like a single bolt. And then I guess in here is what we're left with. I can obviously pull my there we go, quick release steering wheel, that makes things easy. So I've got the light here to try and make it clear on what's going on. So thankfully for me, this is going to be fairly straightforward, I hope. We've got our steering column, obviously. I've got some little spacers here, which I can hopefully copy over from before. Otherwise, it's a straight shot steering column all the way down into that little black grommet thing in there, which is like a rubber dust boot type thing. Inside that rubber grommety thing is a uni joint of some form. Effectively, you can see kind of how this matches up with the gear we've received. So we have received a piece that kind of looks like this. We've received a bracket that looks kind of like that. And then the bit in between is kind of where the motor lives. So obviously we're replacing this whole section from here all the way down to that black piece there. And the bracket we've got basically bolts up to where that stock one is, and then the other bracket bolts up to where this one is. So it's very straightforward. We're just gonna make it happen.
Now, one thing I do need to do is attach this upper steering column. So this is where your steering wheel bolts to the motor section down here. It's a 3-point flange. There's some bolts come in the kit to bolt this down. The motor, the instructions say that the motor hangs out to the right. So that's the top that'll bolt to the sort of the dash bar. That motor will hang out above my right knee. So hopefully something like this.
So I've just put the steering wheel on to make sure that that is centered and currently straight. Hopefully that means when I put it all back together later, I don't have to worry about the steering being off. There's two 12mm bolts here to adjust or to undo the top of the column. Then there's two 12mm nuts down the other end of the column, which is where this bracket goes. And then there's three 10mm nuts for the plastic cover down the bottom here, which I don't know if we actually need to unbolt, but I have unbolted. Now I've got to unbolt the column from the steering shaft yoke-y thing down here. What do you call this? Uni joint. So I've got to get down in there and have a look how I undo that. That's uninstalled, done. Righto, excuse the costume change, you know, time flies and so did the days. So here's where we got to. Everything's now been in and out of the car a few times. This guy came out real easy. This guy needed some work. This guy needed quite a lot of work. The biggest pain point with the right-hand drive car is that it seems like this lower bracket, which attaches sort of around your toes to the firewall, is made for a left-hand drive car, and the two mounting points are at different heights, and it's opposite or mirrored for my car. So I had to effectively cut this guy, swap the sides, and then weld it back together so that it kind of mimicked this more closely. That was a bit of a faff, particularly because these things are all, it's like slotted and then they're all curved. I don't know why they're all bendy like that. This one, the factory one's all straight and there's no slots. So when you've got all these curves and things, it sort of made it harder to work with, harder to bend. But anyway, that needed modification, but it was done. The other thing I did was the mounting position of the motor. So if I rotate this so that it's facing towards you, normally the steering wheel goes here. The motor is on my right, your left. In the car, and according to the instructions, they want the motor swung around sort of 180 degrees from this position. So have the motor hanging out this side. Problem with my car is, right here, there's a brake pedal with a brake pedal light switch, which the motor was colliding with. Now, in theory, you can mount this motor in 3 different orientations. The other 2 orientations that I could have used weren't going to work. One pointed it up to the sky, which meant it hit the bits in the dash, like including bits of metal. And the other one pointed it straight down in front of where my clutch pedal foot is. And that obviously didn't really make sense. So the workaround in this case was to offset the mounting holes by, I guess, half of each mounting hole. There's 3 mounting holes. So I rotated them by half, made little brackets to adjust it. And that meant instead of the motor hanging down like this in front of my clutch foot, it hangs out off to my left, over the left knee, or over the left foot really. And it's perfectly out of the way. You don't even know it's there. Now, with that said and done, it all bolted in and mounted up. Great. However, I felt that there was a bit of movement. So with the stock steering column, you've got the firewall mounts you've got the, I guess, the sort of the dash bar mounts for the steering column, and then the wheel bolts in up here. Because this is all more or less one solid piece, it's sturdy. This end and this end brace everything together. So when you jiggle over here, you're not really levering on anything because it's all one solid piece. However, when these two pieces are separated, although they're joined here, there's movement. Unfortunately, what that means is this kind of is one piece, this is one piece. You've only got two mounting points here. So levering on this allows the motor to move around. Similarly, with the motor moving around, it levers on this, and you've got this sort of flexing against the firewall. So I added extra bracing that didn't come with the kit. For the motor, there's this steel shaft, which I'm assuming from the original car that this motor's from, there was a bolt or something going through that as part of its mounting mechanism. What I did, I actually threaded an M10 thread into this tube, put a bolt in the end, made a little bracket, that bolts to there, and this little bracket effectively just bolts up under the dash. Now this tube is actually free to rotate, or it's fairly solid, but it is free to rotate, so I just threw a bolt through it so it can only rotate so far. That sort of triangulated the mounting of this, much more sturdy. Did something similar with the other end here. So there was an existing hole in this, I don't know why. All I did was cut a piece of tube, I threaded the end of this tube, it's just alloy tube, threaded the end of it with a tap to an M10 thread. A bolt goes in the top there to give me some adjustability in how much I want to attach it to. That bolts onto the end of this. And again, it's just adding some reinforcement, triangulating the mounting so it's not hanging all off one end, leveraging things. It's got some extra support there, and it just made everything much more sturdy. Without those extra braces, you just had a lot more movement in the steering setup. That's the kind of the physical. That's all bolted in for the last time. The physical bit's done, then we can move on to the wiring. And this is what it looks like all installed. So we've got our steering wheel just loosely attached at the moment. That's not actually bolted on, but you know, good enough for demonstration purposes. So the upper steering column, which is, I guess, the cut off of an OEM one. I've reused my spacers here. We've got our motor. Now, as I mentioned, I've got it hooked over to the left. The factory position, the instructions say it should hang over to the right, but as I mentioned, it collides up in here. There we go, it collides up in there with that switch. You can see the wires hanging out of it right in the middle of the screen there, which is the brake pedal light switch. So obviously, being a right-hand drive car, it doesn't work. So hence these brackets, which are obviously offsetting it. And then if we head further down into the tunnel, I'll flick around under here. You can see here our mounting bracket for the bottom section, and then there's the joiner shaft piece, whatever that's called, the lower shaft. So that hooks into the U-joint there that comes out of the firewall. Plastic cover's still off at the bottom section there at the moment, so you can kind of see. And then the two braces. So we've got I guess the motor brace, which is this vertical tube here, and that bolts into that section on the side of the motor, and there's a existing threaded bolt right up there, which is as part of the top of the brake pedal. Don't know why there's a threaded bolt there. Maybe there used to be wires or something, or a relay box or something hanging off that, but I don't use it for anything anymore, so it worked perfectly there. And then for the bottom bracket, which is this one here, you can see I've got a bolt hanging out of there and another bit of alloy tube. That goes right up through the top of the, I guess, the firewall, and there's a bolt right here. So that's a M10, pretty spicy sized bolt, so right there. So literally pulling, or I guess not really pulling, but supporting vertically the motor and then the lower bracket. And what that means is, so before, without those two there, if you put twist in the wheel, so if you turned, obviously the steering wheel itself is a bit wobbly because it's not bolted in, but if you turn the wheel, you could see movement in the motor, slight rotation here, and then as well with that lower bracket, slight rotation in that. Having those two braced in a second position rather than just here at the top and just at the firewall, and having the brake in between meant that the top and the bottom weren't really hanging on to each other. Having that sort of it's not really triangulation, but we'll call it triangulation by having an extra mounting point. It just eliminates so much of the movement that would have existed in this thing. So having those two braces definitely made a difference. And now when I rotate the wheel, there's absolutely far less movement in this thing. Yeah, definitely a design consideration, I guess, for the people who built this kit is the fact that your motor and the bottom shaft and the bracket that attaches, they're not attached to one another. Anyway, now that that's done, I've got to do the wiring here. Now, in theory, that also is quite easy. I might wire it into the kill switch, which lives inside the trans tunnel right above the gearbox. Little bit of a faff to get to. We'll see. I'll go have a look and see if I can find somewhere that works. I got the box mounted in under there. I found a hole. When I say the box, the steering ECU, whatever they call it. I found a hole to bolt it to, not using the actual spot that they say in the instructions. I just found somewhere that I felt was better. The wiring here is hugely long, and I think it's the length set to kind of get it to the boot. They kind of want you to wire this direct to the battery. I realised that that's not necessary, it's too much for me. I also don't need a ground this long. I can just mount the ground straight up onto the dash here, so it only needs to be, 5 or 6 inches long, not 10 foot long. So I'm going to cut this all down. I'm going to cut the black wire down and mount the ground just straight under the dash here, and I'm going to find somewhere else to mount or to hook up the positive to. I have just quickly jumped it onto the bucket battery here, and I made sure it worked, and it did, which was great. So a challenge now to work out where to mount this knob. I am actually thinking of making some sort of bracket that bolts it maybe to the column here or something. I can 3D print something pretty quick, then I'll just bolt it there. This also needs a 12 volt line of ground source, which I'll have to dig up from under here. It came with like a fuse tap type connector here on the end of this wire. I cut that off. I'm not using fuse taps in this car. I'll find an actual wire to crimp this to. So a bit of wiring to do, and then I'll fill you in on where I get to. It's been a while, but the steering is finally done. Now, if you're wondering what's the deal with the costume changes, it's because these things happen over many days. It's not just like a thing that I can do in one day. I work on the car in the spare time that I got in between real life. Let me show you it in the working final configuration. So I 3D printed a bracket here for the adjustment knob. Full left, full anti-clockwise is off. You rotate it about, 5-10 degrees, and the relay box clicks on, and then the further you rotate it from there until whatever that is, about 280, 300 degrees, is sort of minimum to maximum steering assistance. Realistically, the moment it clicks on, that's more than enough steering assistance. I think I really know for sure once I drive it, but so let me flick it on. That's just the fuel pumps priming. The relay box switches on and then switches off after I think it's 10 seconds. There you go, it's off. If I dial the knob up, you hear it click on again, and instantly, and that's with pretty big sticky semi-slick tires. So if I dial the knob sort of all the way up to the max, it's super easy to steer. Realistically, I think I'm going to leave it fairly low on the knob here, and there's still, it's, a stiff finger rather than a floppy finger can turn the wheel. A couple of 3D printed brackets, as I mentioned here, just to mount that thing. I don't know if that's going to be permanent, but that was the solution I went with for now. It's just like a pot with a little control board in there. So zip tied that onto the steering column, and then a second one just to keep the cables tidy. And then up under here, you can see the bunch of white cables. That's the cables for the pot. I've also cable tied these all up against the wires for the motor, and then the main power wire from the battery source. So all in all, working well. However, I kind of thought that the mechanical dramas I had with getting the kind of left-hand drive kit to work in a right-hand drive car was the end of my dramas and the end of my troubles, but no, I couldn't get the unit to work when I first plugged it all in. Testing each component individually, they all seem to work-ish. Use the multimeter on the power source, on the
ECU box, on the motor itself. They all seem to be doing the right things. I tested plugging the motor straight into power and it would turn the wheel. So it seemed to be working fine. It wasn't until I started plugging everything back in together, it would stop working. It would sound like it was clicking on, but when you tried to turn the wheel, it was like the motor wasn't working, and then the ECU control box thing would kind of go, I'm not detecting a motor, I'm going to turn myself off now. It was really weird. Long story short, what I discovered was that one of the pins for the connection from the motor to the power source, which is kind of built into the ECU box thing, was the pin was not crimped correctly. It was like missing a piece inside the plug. I'll put a photo up here and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Basically, it's kind of an oversized spade type connection, and it looks like there's sort of two layers to it. There's an inside and an outside sort of big piece, and the inside sleeve is missing on one of the pins on the motor, which meant that theoretically it either wasn't connecting or it was connecting but not properly, and it was kind of like not able to pull the right amperage or something. Fundamentally meant it wasn't working. Eventually I realized that was the problem and just fixed it by kind of shimming basically making my own little inner sleeve to fit inside that connector. Ideally, I would just recrimp the right plug on there, but you're looking at like $50 just to get that thing online. I googled and probably could contact the people who make this and ask them to send me a crimp or something, but it works now. It's not really worth the drama and the fuss of trying to do that, but yeah, looks like one of the pins was missing a bit of its gizzards, which was a bit of a headache because it cost me half a day of fluffing around trying to work out why it wasn't working. Time to get the dash back in now.
Right, let's finish this video off. Install done. It wasn't as bolting as I'd hoped for a right-hand drive car. I didn't have any other dramas of worrying about stuff that's normally attached to your steering column, like your indicator stalks and all the wiring, that's gizzards that are under there. Clearly some of the bracketry just isn't made for a right-hand drive car. And then the motor wiring, the balked crimp on the plug meant that I was fluffing around diagnosing an issue. That was a bit of a pain in the bum. Otherwise, it went about as expected. Other than that, everything else went in pretty fine. It all went bolted together pretty easy. The steering effort seems to be quite a lot of assist, even at the lower setting. We'll see how that feels once you're actually driving the thing, because sitting here stationary, it's not really a good test of its effectiveness. I did obviously add a few of those extra braces and things to the motor and the mount to really sort of stiffen up and make the whole mechanism much more sturdy and much more attached to the car. You can feel a slight sort of, I don't know what you call it, a slight bit of slop in there that's obviously just inherent in the power steering mechanism that wasn't there before. There's definitely a dead zone, a soft amount of play where it's very loose. But I think realistically, when you're out driving on track, you're not just going, you're turning a lot. And so that small amount of really loose play shouldn't be a problem. It's the movement in the whole system that's an issue. And I've eliminated a lot of that mechanically with the extra braces. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but I'm not going to know if it's any good till I drive the car. That's soon, but I got to find a day where I've got time and when the weather's good so that I can take the car out. I would say that the instructions are a little bit annoying. They're quite brief on the car specific instructions. It does sort of say, you need to know how to pull apart an MX-5 to know how to do this. It's like, yeah, fair enough, but is it really that hard to be a bit more wordy and clear and have more photos of the whole process rather than just like one photo that says install as per photo? Say what that means, and I think they could do a bit more job, of a better job here. And then don't also have like caveats at the top that say, read our other doco on our website first. It's like, just print an extra 2 pages with some more words in it and be clear in the doco in the first place so I don't have to go hunting around for stuff. Now that said, I'm pretty sure I could have installed this, particularly in a left-hand drive car, without this at all. Like, this doesn't really add a lot of value. The info it does add is using the system. What the knob does, where to set it, what clicks do what with the ECU box, and there's also some adjustment you can do with the ECU box in terms of setting kind of, I guess, like a central point, but anyway, it's not really a big drama. But the instructions are a little bit vague. Packaging was okay. It wasn't special, but it was sufficient to make it across the world, which is cool. That's enough waffling. That's the install done. Thanks for watching.